Alright, everybody, it's story time. So, this is going to be kind of a tricky one to get through just because there's so much to go on in this whole thing. There's so much background, there's so much just kind of. There's so many personalities during this time period, there's so many offensives and counteroffensives, tales of great bravery, tales of immense cowardice. It really is kind of, in my view at least, how would you put it, the consummate example of China, at least before communism. What's kind of funny about China, and this rebellion really, I think, exemplified it, is whenever there's a war in China, the casualty total is larger than, like, world wars are. Like, my understanding, because casualties are extremely hard to keep. The Chinese are normally very good at keeping records, but they aren't particularly good during this time period because the central government collapsed. But estimates put the number of people who died during the Taiping Civil War as being between 20 and 30 million. Which is probably more people than died during World War I. The book I read on this, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, said it could be 40, 50 million. No one really knows because, like I said, one of the issues whenever you're dealing with casualties, particularly within failed states, is a lot of times people just leave. They'll just move to another part of the country and they'll disappear off the census rolls. So, like, you can't really count the number of bodies because that's just, it's just logistically not plausible. So you have to go by census records and people just disappear or records get destroyed or people change their names for obvious reasons. So all that stuff kind of happened, but we're fairly sure that about 20 to 30 million people died. So why do so many people die? And we'll get to the story, but there's kind of a lot of interesting background here and just stuff about China. Now, there's a Catholic Brahmin I know. He's kind of a unicorn, I suppose you could say. And his theory as to why the death tolls are so high in China is because the society is so well organized and everyone always works at 100% capacity that if there's any real disruption to it, the whole system falls apart and the various parts of the country can't feed each other. It's very interdependent. And the society is very organized, like I said. The other issue is, in the Confucian social order, soldiers are at the very bottom. In some pyramids I've seen, they're on par or lower than slaves. So China has a long history of treating its soldiers like crap. They don't get paid very well. They don't get fed a lot of the time. The book I was reading said that the soldiers were so poor they couldn't afford to marry, and a lot of them had part-time jobs on the side. The army has traditionally been in a really bad state in China. They were saying how a big issue they had was the number of soldiers on paper was completely different from the number of soldiers the Qing actually had. Because what was very common was local officers would kick people out of the army and pretend and keep them on the rolls and then collect their pay. So another kind of issue is why the army was so bad is China's kind of a world unto itself. And I think in general, central governments made the cynical calculation that it was better to let China get periodically ravaged by outside powers than to have a strong standing army out of danger of a military coup. That was a bigger existential threat to China and to the history of individual dynasties than occasionally having nomadic tribes from the north or a foreign power just kind of ravage them. Which is kind of an interesting calculation because China is kind of impossible to hold by an outside force. The only group who's kind of managed to do it for a significant amount of time were the Qing. And that didn't turn out very well in the long term, as it were. So, and as to why they thought that was less of a threat, I don't know. I'm curious as to, I don't really know if the experience of Japan impacted that at all, because for 90% of its existence, Japan was basically a military dictatorship under the shogun, with the emperor possessing virtually no power. So I don't know if emperors of China looked at that and said, we don't want to emulate this. So because the armies weren't really well paid, they weren't trained, they had virtually no discipline, what would frequently happen throughout the war, particularly among the imperial... Okay, so let's just talk a bit about the imperial armies. So the Qing had two different imperial armies. They had the 8 banners, and they had the green standard. Now, the Qing dynasty were not ethnic Chinese. Ethnicity in China is kind of a sticky subject because theoretically China is a very ethnically homogenous country. It's like 90 to 95% what's normally called Han. And this is one of those things, it's a bit like Hispanic or Arab. Is there really a Han per se? Is there like a one Han ethnic group like there's one German ethnic group? Or is it a group of related peoples who call themselves Han out of convenience or to differentiate themselves from external ethnic groups and external cultures that are more dissimilar? Because they do have their own languages, at least they did prior to the Chinese government trying to impose Mandarin on all of them. There are some minorities in China, like the Uyghurs and the Manchus, but it's, generally speaking, the perception within China is that the Han are the vast majority and they're kind of the native Chinese people. Like I said, whether or not that's a contrivance, a convenience, it's kind of difficult to say. But yeah, so China has historically been Han and ruled by Han dynasties. Now what happened is when the Ming Empire collapsed, the Qing came in. The Qing come from Manchuria up here. The Qing are also the Manchu. Sometimes people will call the Qing dynasty as the Manchu dynasty. They're the exact same thing. Manchu's just to reference the fact that they're foreign. So they swept in and they were a more militarized people. They're a bit like the Turks and the Mongols, I guess, are kind of the closest equivalent to them. They were kind of a more nomadic, or I don't even know nomadic, but they had a much better cavalry tradition. So they swept in and they were able to conquer all of China. So within Qing China, they implemented a great deal of discrimination, at least perceived discrimination. It's kind of hard to tell with a lot of these things because there's propaganda on both sides. But the idea is that they came in and they imposed a lot of discrimination against the native Chinese population. In particular, you have a hairstyle known as the queue. So the queue is kind of the traditional, what people think is the traditional Chinese hairstyle, where they shave their head but they have the long braid. They also force them to wear kind of what they consider to be embarrassing clothing. The idea was that Han Chinese would be instantly recognizable to the Manchu overlords and they could look down upon them. So there was that. They forced them to wear kind of embarrassing clothes. They faced kind of widespread discrimination. Now, I'm no real advocate of multiculturalism, but if you're ruling a society in which you're 5% or whatever of the population, and you're actively discriminating and humiliating 95% of the population, that's not really a good idea. And that's throughout the history of the Qing dynasty, especially once we get in kind of more modern nationalism, there was widespread hatred of the Qing, viewing them to a large extent correctly as a foreign occupation force. So back to kind of the original point I was trying to make. The 8 Banner Army was made up of ethnic Manchus, ethnic Mongols, and ethnic Turks. Basically, Mongolia and some of these other kind of traditional nomad regions were conquered by the Manchus specifically so they could bring in more non-Han populations and add them to the 8 Banner Army. So China has traditionally not been a particularly feudal state, but the 8 Banners were a feudal army. They were given land grants, etc., and they were expected to be kind of an elite. Despite that, over time, they became increasingly decadent, outmoded, etc., and by the time of the Second Opium War, you had like 60,000 Mongol cavalrymen getting beaten by like 3,000 British soldiers in a complete massacre. I don't even recall if the British lost any soldiers in that battle. But yeah, so that was about, I think, 10 to 20% of the army. And then the rest was the Green Standard Army, which were which was theoretically a couple million people, and it was made up of ethnic Han and related ethnic groups, and they were just spread out all through the country in very small garrisons normally. Once again, the paranoia was of a military coup, and in the Confucian social order, soldiers are placed very low. So the Qing dynasty had really started to get decadent. The Qing emperors didn't leave the Forbidden City. They imposed widespread discrimination against the Han majority, and their military power continued to sink. What ultimately happened that kind of sparked this all off is you had the Opium War. So essentially, China has always been, I call the Chinese probably the most naturally conservative people on the planet, and they don't really have an interest beyond China. Periodically, governments like the Tang will conquer, in their case, Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, parts beyond China or Korea or Vietnam, but China kind of has natural borders, and it's so large, no sane man would really want more territory. Even when they had their brief period of exploration, it was never particularly serious. They didn't really want colonies because China's huge. China's a world unto itself. So they weren't very interested in the outside world. And when the British came and they wanted Chinese cotton and China ware and tea, they didn't have anything the Chinese really wanted. So the Chinese were saying, okay, well, give us gold and silver, and we'll sell it to you for cash. And the British were like, we don't really want to run a balance of payments. So they went to war with China, and they forced the Chinese government to legalize opium. Now, I'm not going to get into the morality of this, but I think it's the worst thing we ever probably did as a Western people was the Opium War. Because it forced the legalization of opium, and the British sold opium to the Chinese in exchange for Chinese goods. So the Chinese Empire was humiliatingly defeated in the Opium War. So you have the background of the Taiping Rebellion is you have discrimination against the majority. You have a dynasty that's corrupt and decadent. You have a dynasty that's incapable of managing to fight off foreign threats, and a dynasty where the divisions between rich and poor keep growing. Economic inequality is a very destabilizing impact has a very destabilizing impact on society long term. It just does. The plebs will only take so much before they understandably rise up and try to overthrow the people who are screwing them. So you had all this, you had increasing Western influences throughout China. So kind of into this, we have a very fascinating figure. I'm going to butcher his name. Hong Xiuquan, I think is how you pronounce it. Hong Xiuquan? We're just going to go with Hong Xiuquan. So Hong Xiuquan was from the Hakka ethnic group, which is in southeastern China, which is kind of a subset of the Han ethnic group, seen as native Chinese. And he was noted for being very brilliant. He was also 6'3", so he was a super Chad. But he was an extremely skilled scholar. So how you advanced within the Chinese society is China didn't have a nobility per se. There were people who held noble titles, but in a lot of cases that was just left over from previous dynasties or particular rewards. How you advanced in Chinese society was you passed the imperial examinations. So you would go and write an exam at the provincial level and then maybe at the imperial level, and all the civil service jobs in the society were doled out on that basis. And in the Confucian social order, the scholar bureaucrat occupies the highest rung of power, or occupies the most prestigious spot, whereas soldiers are, like I said, are at the bottom, merchants are like after them, and farmers and craftsmen are above them. Farmers were regarded as being near the top, just below scholars, because they produce food that people eat, which is interesting. Not that many Western societies don't work that way, generally speaking. But it was very common for merchant families to spend a lot of money to try to get a member of their family to be able to pass the exams so their family could move up. It's kind of like what happens with what's called middlemen minorities in Western societies, like Jews, Lebanese, etc., and Chinese, where they first start out as becoming wealthy, and then they move into law, medicine, and politics to kind of combine political and social power with their economic power. So with Hong, basically what happened is his family, who was fairly well off, went into huge debt, and it just tried to pay for his education to pass the imperial examinations. And he did very well at the first run, but then he lost in the second run, and he would take the exam, I think it was 2 more times, and he would fail each time. Now, people will say, oh, he was dumb, he couldn't pass the exams. But you have to understand how dumb the imperial examinations were. So the only topic that they were really on, and I've done some research into this, and it's very hard to find specifics, was on the Confucian classics. So to do the exams, there was like a different language you had to learn, Old Chinese, with a different character system. You had to basically memorize the Confucian classics. From what I was able to read, there was a combination of different questions. There was fill in the blank. Like it would say on page 10, section 5, sentence 3, and then they give you part of a sentence and you had to complete the rest. You had to quote different things. You had to write in a very specific way. Your calligraphy was you were marked in your calligraphy. If you quoted a single character wrong from the Confucian classic, you'd fail. They would have the question, what would Confucius do, or what would Confucius say after this situation? And that was the exam. People would try to cheat on the exams. They wouldn't write the answers down. They tried to sneak in copies of the Confucian classics, written on grains of rice sometimes, written on fans, etc., because that's what the exam was based on, your ability to rote from a small number of texts. So it's not a very good system. It did create a common culture of, I guess, a common culture among the elite, you could say, because everyone would have to go through the same system, and it did kind of create something like that, but it did nothing to really ensure that people were talented. So, like, I wrote the civil service exam one time in Canada, and the civil service exam in Canada will test your ability with grammar, with problem solving, with, I think, basic math skills. It'll give you a series of situations. It'll ask you how you would deal with these situations. So it tests character, basic education, and basic literacy. And those are all important things to have someone serving your state bureaucracy. But in China, that didn't happen. It was based on how well you had memorized the Confucian classics. So Hong kept failing them, and he kind of sunk into a deep depression. And he read some pamphlets that a local minister had given to him, and he had a series of visions where he came to believe that he was the third part of the Trinity, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. You had the Father, the Son, and then you had the younger brother. So he created his own kind of brand of Protestant Christianity that came to be known as the God Worshippers. Now, as with... some people have said Mormonism is probably the closest equivalent, as it was largely just based on whatever the leader of the movement had. But it was interesting because it was kind of a syncretism of socialism, Han Chinese nationalism, Protestant Christianity, with some Confucian and localist elements. It basically, I think, is best seen as a reaction against the Manchu and their failures as a governing class. So, well, it kind of started out as a religious movement. As time went on, you had a lot of people who were just drawn to the Taiping because they wanted to bring down the Ming. The Taiping offered the promise of a modernized China that had removed the Qing influences, and where there would be a redistribution of property, and the Rodin examination system would be overthrown. Interestingly, the Taiping kept the examination system. They just switched it from the Confucian classics to the Bible, which is really, really based. So instead of what would Confucius do, like exam questions were like, what would Jesus do? Which is awesome. So the Taiping rapidly kind of broke out of their position in southeastern China from kind of the Hakka homeland and just seemed to be unstoppable. They took Nanking very early, which kind of led to a lot of issues. A friend of mine said, I think, Argent, the reason why polygamous societies collapse is because it's just too much fun. So once the Taiping took Nanjing, Hong really didn't play much role in the future of the war. He just spent all his time in his palace with his concubines. Interestingly, polygamy was banned, but the Taiping leadership were mainly polygamous, which is kind of funny. The Taiping had a federal monarchy, so everybody who was high ranking was a king or a prince. So you had Hong Xiuquan as the heavenly king, but you also had the shield king, the east king, the west king, the loyal king, etc. Basically, anyone who was high up was made a king. It was a kind of a bit of the aren't we all equal in the Brotherhood of Darkness thing that was going on. So the Taiping armies, tried to impose a lot of things. Opium was banned. They attempted to kind of come up with a program of westernization. Confucian and Buddhist shrines were destroyed. The idols smashed. The examination systems were overthrown. The Manchu were killed and driven out. The queue was abandoned. The people in the areas under Taiping occupation would frequently cut off their queues and grow their hair out. They would become known as long hairs, was kind of the nickname that the Taipings got because they would grow their hair out. Now, what was common was people in the occupied areas would tuck the queue under their hats and grow the rest of their hair out. So if the Qing took the area back over, they would just shave their heads and be like, yeah, we were loyal all the time. Because there were times when the Taiping would kill people who kept the queue, and the Qing would kill people because they had long hair. Yeah, China was super petty back then. So the Taiping tried to redistribute wealth, collectivize the land. They basically promised a fair shake for the Chinese. So you had a lot of people who, like Li Suqian, who were drawn to them, who weren't god worshippers and really had no role with it. So we'll talk a bit more about Li Suqian later, but he was a charcoal maker who came from the very poorest rungs of Chinese society, but he was a military genius who was responsible for many of the Taiping's greatest victories. So we move to kind of another big, probably the biggest figure within, I guess kind of the big three are Hong Xiuquan, sorry, I'm really bad, Hong Xiuquan, Han Rengan, and Li Ziqian. I'm sorry, my Chinese pronunciations are really bad. So Hong Jincan, whatever. We'll just call him Hong. We'll just call him the Prime Minister. So he was interesting because he was a distant cousin, given his name obviously, of the founder of the movement. So after the Taiping had begun, he kind of got cut off from them and he went to Hong Kong, where he learned English, he learned kind of more orthodox Protestant Christianity, and he learned all the benefits of westernization. So he eventually would make his way back, and his cousin would promote him to prime minister and the de facto head of the Taiping state. His belief was if he could court the Western powers, particularly on the question of religion, portraying themselves as Christians fighting against pagan devil worshippers, then the Taiping could eventually win. Interestingly, kind of throughout the conflict, the Western powers backed the Qing. Even when they claimed to be impartial, they still de facto backed the Qing, which we'll get to in a minute. But he wanted to introduce a constitution, redistribution of wealth, railroads, newspapers, capitalism, industrialize the country. He wanted good relations with the foreign powers, openness to foreign trade, all that kind of stuff. And kind of one of the things I find throughout the book, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, was that the missionaries kept promising him things. He let them into Nanjing. He put up with a lot of their nonsense, even when they got into fights with Taiping leaders. But in the end, they ultimately delivered nothing for him. A few of them actually even advocated for him in the West, and they weren't able to get him any support. By the end of it, he just basically told them to screw off because he had no real more use for them, because they hadn't given him anything, and they just criticized the Taiping because they had really weird doctrines. So he basically told them to screw off, and all the missionaries called for the destruction of the Taiping, and it helped motivate Western governments to act against them. But yeah, he tried really hard to modernize, and he was not a bad military leader, from if what I recall about the book. Li Zuqian, who was more conservative and wasn't really interested in the religious aspect, he saw it as more of a social and nationalist movement, really kind of butted heads with him. He also really promoted the whole Han Chinese nationalism aspect of it, portraying them as a crusade to sweep away the corrupt Manchu. So what kind of happened for most of the first half of the war is, I think it's fair to say that the Qing government collapsed. The Qing lost most of their revenue. Ironically, the only revenue they still had was from foreign trade ports, because the British and French and whoever made sure to pay their dues, their custom dues. So that was the only source of revenue they still had. They had pretty much no control anymore over the various field armies. The various armies were just running around like their heads cut off, and they'd occasionally offer battle to the Taipings. The Taipings, while not necessarily better trained, tended to be better equipped just because they made that a priority, and a lot of them were fanatical, either in terms of the movement's socialist or religious overtones. And they would just kind of rout the Imperial Armies. Now, what's kind of funny, because this is China and armies are so poorly disciplined, is after a Qing army would rout, they would normally go and sack the closest couple cities, imperial cities, that would let them in, and then run away and disperse. So they would frequently just lay waste to their own part of the countryside, and the Taipings would sweep in. Now, the Taipings were also ruthless in looting, but not quite as bad as the Imperial Army. Discipline was a little better. But you just had devastating defeat after devastating defeat, and the war kind of settled into a slugging match, with the Taipings gradually gaining more and more land. So the Qing dynasty was basically collapsed by this point. Added to this, the Second Opium War happened, where the British basically just marched to Beijing and demanded a bunch of concessions from the emperor. The emperor actually just fled Beijing, and the British burned down the imperial palace after looting it. So within to this, we have Zhang Gufan? I'll just call him Zhang, who was a very unlikely general. He was kind of a mild-mannered scholar from Hunan province who had finally passed the highest level of the examinations just prior to the rebellion. Now, it's common practice in China that bureaucrats don't serve in their home regions out of fear of developing their own power base. What had happened, though, is his parents had died, and he had gone back to Hunan for a period of grieving, for because you're supposed to do that in Confucianism, and he was like kind of an ultra-conservative when it came to Confucian practices. He was very, very devoted to it. So he happened to be there, and basically nothing was working, everything was falling apart, and he saw it as his duty to restore order to China, to kind of fill in the hole of the central government. So he figured what he was going to do is he was going to build his own army, the Hunan army. Now, people say, well, it's just one province in China. I mean, if we look at this, Hunan's not that big. But keep in mind, this is China, so provinces within China are larger than countries in other parts of the world. So Hunan today has a population of 67 million. Let me see what the population of France is. I forget what it is exactly. I think it's about that much. Let me see, population of France. Yes, exactly. 67 million, pretty much. Okay, so yeah, pretty much exactly. So his province had the same population as France. So theoretically, all things being equal, it could field an army as big as the French army. And this was later on, so the population had grown since Napoleon. So he came up with the idea, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to recruit everyone from the same province, the same ethnic group, the same culture, and we're going to keep villages together. So this brigade will all come from the same area, this brigade will all come from the same area, and people kind of knew one another, and the officers were local elites. So what was good about this is if anybody looted or they ran or whatever, the other members of the army would know who they were, so they couldn't really get away with it. So he introduced some other kind of novel concepts, like paying his soldiers. He dramatically boosted their pay to like a semi-fair wage and tried to make sure as much as possible they were paid on time. They improved rations. He tried to buy them proper equipment. They introduced discipline. People were punished for infractions. They drilled a lot. They were able to kind of introduce some discipline and order to what had been a war of armies with little of either. So you had this kind of ethnically homogenous army that was better equipped and paid better. Now, he would have terminal funding problems throughout the war, but this was still a lot better than anything else the various Chinese factions came up with, and it would ultimately be the Hunan army and similar efforts by local mandarins that were able to put down the Taipings. And what this kind of led to in China is the warlord era, because the central government no longer effectively had an army per se. What was left of the Green Standard and Green Banner forces were scattered and basically worthless. They were reduced to garrison forces. So various other mandarins also raised their own local armies in a similar style, and they started to have success against the Taipings. You also had the issue of Western intervention. Now, what had kind of happened during this war is the Western powers defended the various legation ports where they had trade posts, and they wouldn't let the Taipings take them over. Now, Shanghai had a large Chinese section, but they wouldn't let the Taipings take over the Chinese section, which meant the Taipings had difficulty establishing kind of formal trade relations with the West, and the Manchus were able to keep open their connections to the West, to keep trading for silver and that kind of thing, while at the same time they kept getting their custom dues, which was really the only source of income they had left. And because the Qing government was in so much debt to the English and French, they ultimately kind of saw it as their duty to prop it up. They viewed a weakened Qing government as the least bad option to come out of the war. So the war would continue for another couple of years. Millions of people died. Southeastern China was more or less burned to the ground during this time period. It was one of the great disasters in human history. Now, ultimately, Nanking was conquered by the Hunan army with assistance from the British, and it turned out Hong Xiuquan had actually died of cancer or something during the intervening time. It's kind of funny during the siege of Nanking, because most of Nanking's population had left, so he had a population of like 30,000 within a city designed for 500,000. So what they had done was they bulldozed large sections of the city and started growing crops within the walls. So despite it being a siege, the people inside were actually better fed than the people on the outside. But after they took Nanjing, you had Han Rengan and the son of Han Xiuquan fleeing south along with Li Zhuchen. Li Zhuchen got captured, tortured, and executed. Eventually, Hong Rengan was captured and executed, and so was Han Xiuquan. And the Qing government ultimately put down the rebellion and engaged in a genocide against the Hakka people. So they had won the Civil War, but they hadn't really. Ultimately, what had beaten them was intervention by the Western powers and the ability of local mandarins or local scholar gentry to raise their own armies. While some of them were disbanded, ultimately some of them would become the new nucleus of the new Imperial Army, which had no loyalty to the Manchu, of which was a different ethnic group that they discriminated against, and the imperial government had permanently lost faith. Actually, it's interesting because Zhang was basically asked by his brother, look, you have the only functional army left, really, of decent size, so march north, overthrow the Manchus, and make your own dynasty. And he was a simple man, and he really didn't want he had no desire to betray his rulers. At the same issue, no one wanted the throne of China, because then they would inherit all of China's problems. They would have to try to centralize a realm that was basically in a state of complete collapse. So the Qing government gave him governorship of Nanjing and a couple different provinces and showered honors on him, but tried to keep him busy for the rest of his life. So ultimately after this, you would have various movements within China, modernizers and reactionaries. Shishi came to power around this time, the Empress Dowager, who was utterly inept. And basically, she was a conservative in the sense she wanted to preserve the kleptocracy, but she kept vacillating between modernization and anti-modernization, and she had a habit of poisoning emperors before they came of age to maintain her status as regent. So ultimately, the Manchu were swept away quite easily during the the Zhang Revolution, where you had Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek and eventually Mao. So Mao viewed the Taipings favorably as a proto-Chinese nationalist movement and as a socialist movement, which is kind of interesting that he viewed them positively given the fact that they were religious in nature. But it did permanent damage to the view of Christianity in China, and I guess that's kind of one of the reasons it's been so slow to move, because of its association with the Taipings. So what can be said about the Taiping Rebellion as a whole? That the Taipings were very much kind of, I think, representative of perennial problems in China, of just kind of general issues that it kept having throughout. And it serves as kind of one of the more fascinating but lesser explored kind of moments in early modern history. So I hope I didn't ramble too much. I hope that was kind of followable and it sort of made sense. I had to skip a lot of stuff because the book I read was really long and it didn't even cover like the first half of the rebellion. But hopefully you know a bit more about the Taiping Rebellion. Hopefully you found that interesting, and I'll talk to you guys later. More videos to come.